So first of all, thank you for participating in this training session on the FIU's AML CFT supervision process. As stated on the FIU website, this training session will be recorded and made available for free to all subject persons at any time. So if you have any questions or concerns, please feel free to contact us on queries at fiumalta.org and our dedicated team will respond to your concern. Just a short introduction on myself. My name is Michael Gatt, and I am a senior risk officer within the supervision team. So basically, this session will discuss the AML supervisory examination process and also the FIU's risk assessment of subject persons. We will begin with an overview of the FIU's risk profile and the risk assessment process, which I will present myself. My colleague Barbara will then explain the AML supervisory examination process, and following this, my colleagues Clyde and Barbara will discuss the post-examination process. At the end of this presentation, my colleague Jeremy from the enforcement section will explain the enforcement process and the actions taken by the FIU following an examination. As I said, I'm going to start first the presentation on the FIU's Caspar system and the risk assessment process. As you are aware, the FIU is subject to and also committed to complying with various international regulatory expectations for the prevention of money laundering and financing of terrorism through the financial system. The FIU works closely with other regulators, namely the MFSA and the MGA, to supervise the activities of applicable sole practitioners, legal persons, and legal arrangements operating within Malta. As required by the 5th AML Directive and the FATF recommendations, supervisors should apply a risk-based approach when conducted supervisory activities. In fact, the FIU, as the authority responsible for AML-CFT in Malta, determines the frequency and the intensity of supervision on an assessment of the ML FT risk profile of subject persons, and also the adequacy of their internal controls. Just to give you a short introduction on the compliance and supervision platform for assessing risk, which is better known as Caspar. Caspar is a tailor-made web-based application developed exclusively for the FIU. It went live for subject persons for registration and the submission of the RQs in 2019. All subject persons are obliged to register to access this application in order for subject persons to submit their yearly RQ and also to update their profile amongst others. Furthermore, through Caspar, the FIU performs a detailed risk analysis of subject persons with respect to the risk that these persons or entities pose to the Maltese regime through the facilitation of or engagement in activity indicative of ML-FT. So the purpose of Caspar is mainly to provide a sound, transparent and reputable foundation for the risk scoring of current and future AML-CFT risk assessments. In particular, it specifies the quantitative rating scale, the qualitative criteria, and weighting scale used by the risk assessment to determine a risk score or rating of subject person based upon the information collected across multiple data sources, which will be explained in more details in the following slides. Additionally, the risk assessment enables the FIU to quantify the inherent risk of each subject person as well as the controls in place to mitigate such risk to derive to the residual risk. Just to give you a perspective, inherent risk represent the exposure that to MLFT risk without any consideration of preventative or mitigating controls, while the control effectiveness is the extent to which existing controls prevent or mitigate negative consequences. Then, the residual risk is determined through a conversion of matrix and the risk that remains after the application of controls to the inherent risk is the residual risk. Also, the FIU applies the risk assessment scoring methodology to assess and determine the risk score of all relevant subject persons across the 18 subsectors under its supervision on an ongoing basis, with information from subject persons and other licensing authorities, of which most data sources, referred to as data blocks, are updated on an annual basis. The FIU also gathers information on an ad hoc basis throughout the year and updates this course upon submission of any additional information on a subject person. Lastly, the FIU monitors all the changes to the risk rating of subject persons and tracks the history on Caspar in order to maintain a full audit of the risk assessments and all the data submissions. As already explained in the previous slides, the FIU's risk assessment process is managed through the Caspar system, which is based on a multi-score risk assessment, implying that the risk rating of a subject person is based on the risk data obtained from different sources. In order to assess the risk presented by subject persons effectively, the FIU considers an array of data coming from different sources, referred to as data blocks, in calculating the risk scores and the risk ratings. On this slide, I'm going to go through them very briefly, but they will be explained further in the coming slides as well. So in Block 1 basically includes information obtained through the risk evaluation questionnaire, which is commonly known as the REQ, which is a self-assessment filled on a yearly basis by the subject person about their inherent risk and also their control effectiveness. Block 2 contains information which is obtained from prudential regulators, namely the MFSA and the MGA. The responses from the MFSA and the MGA cover sector-specific inherent risk and general control effectiveness of subject persons from the MFSA's and the MGA's perspective. In case of the MFSA, these include credit institutions, financial institutions, collective investment schemes, investment service, insurance undertakings and intermediaries, e-money, payment service providers, VFA agents and VFA service providers, trust and trustees, corporate service providers, and other corporate entities and sole practitioners that require MFSA's authorization. On the other hand, in case of the MGA, these include the gaming sector, such as the land-based casinos and the remote gaming that require the MGA's authorization. Block 3 includes information obtained from the analysis section of the FIU, such as the quality of the STRs filed by the subject persons and their prompt response to requests for information. Block 4 includes information obtained from the post-examinations submission by the lead examining unit, such as the supervision section within the FIU, the financial crime compliance sections within the MGA, and the MFSA, or actions taken by the Compliance Monitoring Committee on subject persons. Block 5 includes results or findings sourced from the supranational risk assessment, including risk rating at the product service level, while Block 6, which is similar to Block 5 but includes information on the results or findings sourced from the National Risk Assessment, including risk ratings at the sub-sector level. Block 7 includes any material, negative information, or adverse media reports, information from compliance notes, supervisory meetings, and from prudential supervision, which result in an increase in the residual risk designation. So although a formal process of risk assessment is carried out annually, the system allows updates at any risk rating throughout the year, or as soon as a new information is received and processed. And the results of the risk assessment are utilized to prepare the supervisory plan, which initiates the supervisory cycle of the year. So as mentioned, the REQ is one of the data that contributes to the assessment of the subject person's overall risk rating. Then, throughout April of each year, every subject person who provides relevant activity or relevant financial activity as per Regulation 2 of the Prevention of Money Laundering and Funding of Terrorism has to submit the REQ. The FIU developed around 30 REQs covering the 18 sectors under its supervision, each of which includes both subsector specific questions in order to aid the FIU in understanding the subject person's risks and the controls that the subject person has in place in order to mitigate such risk and to understand the client base of the subject person. Furthermore, the FIU periodically reviews the scope of the risk assessment and amends it as necessary to capture all the sectors, subsectors, and subject persons operating in Malta. However, it is very important that subject persons register on Caspar and complete the REQ in a timely um, in order to avoid any administrative penalties, which can be between the range of €1,000 and €46,500 for both late submission and non-submission. It is also important that subject persons ensure that the data or information that is being included in the REQ is complete and factual, as this will be one of the factors taken into account in determining the subject person's risk profile. As a consequence of not submitted the REQ or inaccurate data will increase the subject person's risk rating and thus will also increase the supervision frequency and the intensity. It is important also to note that the FIU also cross-checks registrations with various other bodies, such as the MFSA, the MGA, the Notarial Council, the Real Estate Licensing Board, and the Accountancy Board, so it is very important that any subject person providing relevant activity registers on Caspar and submits the yearly REQ. So therefore, we encourage everyone to subscribe to the FIU's newsletter, as the FIU uses this medium to communicate with each subject person with important updates from time to time. So as I mentioned, that the REQ gives an understanding of the inherent risk in comparison to the controls. So by way of examples, some of the inherent risk and controls are the following. For the inherent risk, we have the customers, the product and services, the geography and interface distribution channels. Well, for the effectiveness of control, we have some information about the governance, the business risk assessment, the customer acceptance and risk assessment, policies and procedures, ongoing monitoring, internal audit or independent testing, reporting, AML safety training, and record keeping. Moving to Block 2, the FIU considers assessments from prudential supervisors in the calculation of subject persons risk because the supervisors have regular contact and familiarity with the subject persons. So the MFSA submits responses to Block 2 MFSA specific RQs for credit institutions, financial institutions, collective investment schemes, investment services, insurance undertakings and intermediaries, in-money payment service providers, VFA agents and VFA service providers, trust and trustees, and corporate service providers. On the other hand, the MGA submits responses to Block 2 MGA-specific RQs for the gaming sector, which includes the land-based casinos and the gaming licenses and remote gaming subsectors. Moreover, the FIU developed RQs to facilitate the collection of information from its supervisor counterparts, which comprise information related to the fitness of subject persons management and the controls employed to manage AML CFT risk. Namely, the RQs request information on the complexity of ownership and corporate structure, foreign or domestic institution, corporate culture, relationship with the supervisors, management fitness, business model and strategy, three line of defense model, internal governance, compliance functions, and negative or adverse information from public and non-public sources, and compliance history and incidents. As with the case with the REQ, the MFSA and the MGA supervisory assessment, as derived from the response from Block 2 REQs, contribute to the final inherent risk and control effectiveness scores. For each subject person, the analysis section within the FIAU completes block 3 RQ, which basically assess whether the subject person has registered on the FIU's Go AML system, whether the subject person's is responsiveness to the FIU request, the number of STRs submitted by the subject person, and the quality of information submitted. Based on the analysis section's response to the block 3 RQ, a control effectiveness score contributes to define as subject person's control effectiveness score. Given that block 3 provides information focused specifically on controls evaluations, it does not produce an inherent risk score. Block 4 produces information on examination submitted by the lead examining unit, for example, from the supervision section within the FIU, the financial crime compliance section within the MFSA, and the AML unit within the MGA, or measures taken in response to compliance monitoring committee decisions. Following an examination, the examining units completes RRQ and responses recap the following: its understanding of the examined subject person, compliance with its AML CFT obligations, the seriousness of findings stemming from the examination, the cooperation of the subject person with the regulator, any remedial actions required or actions in progress or concluded, and decisions taken by the CMC. Officers submit post-examination review information on an ad hoc basis for subject persons that were subject to an examination. The supervision section will resubmit information that reflects any CMC decision or for any other purpose, even if it is already submitted a post-examination review update. So based on the examining unit's responses to the RQs, an inherent risk and control effectiveness score contribute to define a subject person's residual risk score. In blocks 5 and 6, the results or findings sourced from the supranational risk assessment, including qualitative risk rating at the product service level, or from the national risk assessment, including qualitative ratings at the subsector levels, affect the content and weightings of the RAQ questions, as well as the final inherent risk and control effectiveness of the subject person. Block 7 takes into consideration and information from whistleblowers, allegations received by the FIU on subject persons, information from subscription-based, public media, and non-public sources, including information regarding various types of adverse or negative information, which will have a direct impact on the subject person's final residual rating. Other information considered under Block 7 includes information from compliance notes received from the Intelligence Analysis Unit, information from supervisory meetings, and findings from prudential supervision. If the FIU or any of the supervisory authorities identify any adverse information regarding a particular subject person, the risk team within the supervision section investigates and evaluates whether it is truly relevant and material. Once corroborated with and deemed material, the risk team uploads the information in Block 7 on an ad hoc basis. Once all data sources are inputted into Caspar, Caspar automatically calculates the final scores of the inherent risk, the control effectiveness, and the residual risk for each subject person. If there was no information during the yearly risk assessment from a particular block, but informations become available during the year, Caspar will dynamically recalculate the scoring based on the combination of the annual RQ responses for the other blocks and the newly submitted responses to the block. For instance, if an examination of the subject person was not carried out during the yearly assessment but was completed later, responses to the post-examination questionnaire are considered and the risk score is recalculated as soon as the questionnaire is completed by the compliance officer. Then a final residual risk classification consisting of low, lower medium, higher medium, high, and very high risk is assigned to each subject persons after taking into consideration the inherent risk and the control effectiveness. It is very important to highlight that every subject person, irrespective of its size or category, is subject to a regulatory review by the FIAU. However, the frequency of the regulatory review may differ from one subject person to another depending on the information made available from the previous explained data blocks. Therefore, it is very important that all subject persons, irrespective of the risk score, adhere to the AML CFT measures and to make sure that they are well prepared in case they are selected for a regulatory review. As you are aware, Caspar also includes a section named Subject Person Profile, whereby subject persons are required to update this step with information relating to the entity or individual about the shareholders, beneficial owners, the directors, auditor, the license information in case of an authorized entity, annual turnover information, products and services offered, and information on the group such as the parent company and or subsidiary company. Furthermore, subject persons are also required to upload their business risk assessment and in case their entity, the ownership and the control structure. This module is customizable as it depends on the sector, the subsector, and the categories that are chosen by the subject person on the Caspar system. So before concluding my presentation, one is also reminded to update the subject person profile whenever there is a change within the subject person structure. For example, if the beneficial owner or the shareholders changes when you submit your financial statements to the MBR and or filing the tax returns, so that you update the annual turnover information and to upload the BRA as soon as the BRA is updated. Lastly, if you have any questions or queries related to the FIAU's Caspar system and the risk assessment process, you are kindly requested to send us an email on caspar@fiaumalta.org. Now I will give my floor to my colleague Barbara, where she will focus her presentation on the process of the compliance examinations.
Thank you, Michael. Hello, I'm Barbara, and I form part of the DNFBP's team within the supervision section. My part of the presentation will focus on the procedures followed during the compliance examination. I will provide information on the supervisory examination process, what type of compliance examinations are conducted, and how they take place by describing different stages of compliance examination. I will also explain what is expected from subject persons and advise you on best practices to be adopted during the examination process. Just by way of introduction, as I am sure you already know, the FIAU has supervisory powers, and these powers are enshrined in the PMLA and PLM-FTR. Article 26(2)(c) of the PMLA specifically mentions that the FIAU may carry out examinations on subject persons with the aim of establishing compliance with the provisions of the PMLA and any regulations made thereunder. The FIAU supervisory section is entrusted with numerous roles, starting with risk assessment, which is performed by the risk team, as was already explained by my colleague Michael. Supervision role, to ensure adequate supervisory coverage of all the subsectors in which subject persons operate. The supervision is split into three distinct teams: the credit and financial institutions, the investments, gaming and VFAs, and the designated non-financial businesses and professions, DNFBPs. Each team is mainly responsible for conducting supervisory action to assess the subject person's compliance with AML and CFT obligations stemming from the PMLA, the PML-FTR, and the FIAU's implementing procedures. We have also remediation role, overviewing remediation actions taken by the subject persons, which is the responsibility of the remediation team and will be further explained by my colleague Clyde. We have also quality control and cooperation role. A team for such was set up in 2021. However, in the context of the growth and increased complexity of the FIAU supervisory operations, the function was separated into two different teams in 2022. So now we have quality control team taking care of the quality of supervisory related processes, and cooperation team, which is responsible for the cooperation on AML and CFT matters. And of course, we have the role to provide guidance to the subject persons. As can be seen from the slide, we have a number of methods that we use in our supervisory role. With respect to examinations, such may vary in scope. Full scope examinations, which cover the whole spectrum of risks and activities of the concerned subject person from an AML perspective, produce a holistic view of the supervised framework at that point in time. We also have targeted examinations, which are carried out with the aim of reviewing a specific aspect of the AML CFT framework. As an example, we can review CRA or BRA. We have also thematic examinations, which are very similar to targeted examinations, with the difference that the focus of the examination will be on a particular theme in relation to the subject person. For example, the provision of directorship services by CSPs, or the compliance with beneficial ownership obligations also by CSPs. Such examinations are carried out on a number of subject persons with similar characteristics in terms of risk, to assess importance of obligations amongst different subject persons. It is important to note that thematic examinations are two-level compliance assessments. They include an individual level and an overall sectoral level. In simple words, we're not only performing this to see how a particular subject person complies with its obligations, but also to understand the overall compliance and practices of the whole sector. We may also perform follow-up examinations, which are aimed at assessing the progress in implementing remedial actions or corrective measures prescribed by the FIAU further to a previous examination. We also perform supervisory meetings, which allow us to maintain an updated understanding and knowledge of subject persons, and are intended to assess the design of controls in place, but include limited testing with respect to the actual implementation of controls and their effectiveness. We can also perform an ad hoc visits. We may sometimes deviate from the three types of the visits mentioned, where there is a higher risk of adverse media. These visits may be targeted to a specific number of files in relation to a particular customer. An example would be where we carry out a visit and ask the subject person to give us everything they have on file. In any case and any type of the visit, the subject person is clearly informed on the way forward and whether any meetings are to be held. All the process is explained clearly to the subject person. The reason for such visits stems from the high-risk factors related to a subject person and therefore merit instant attention and deviation from the supervisory plan. Further to what was said previously with respect to the thematic examinations, following such examinations, the risk team gathers the results of examination and publishes papers, which aim in guiding subject persons on areas where they can improve and provide also best practices. Last year, the FIAU published 2 papers, one on the results of the thematic examination performed on the CSPs with respect to their compliance with the beneficial ownership obligations and provision of directorship services provided by CSPs also. For further guidance, you have on the slide link through which you can access any guidance papers. It is important to know that supervision is not limited to examinations, and the FIAU might also request a meeting with the subject person, where the subject person will be asked to provide the FIAU with an update and detail its current procedures. Supervisory meetings are held between the subject person and the FIAU officials to understand the procedures through which AML and CFT obligations are being fulfilled by the subject person. It allows the FIAU to engage with the sector and maintain an ongoing understanding of main concerns and activities of the subject persons. It also ensures the correctness of the risk rating assigned through the risk assessment process. It allows to understand the level and quality of controls implemented by the subject person and, of course, guide subject persons in carrying out any improvements. These meetings are intended to assess the design of controls in place and includes limited testing to assess the actual implementation of controls and their effectiveness. It usually follows with a communication to the subject person on areas where the design of controls can be improved. The supervisory meeting may be followed by a compliance examination if such will be deemed necessary. The subject person is usually advised about such meetings 2 weeks in advance. I would like to note here that these meetings don't necessarily need to be planned by the FIAU, meaning that we often receive requests from subject persons to have meetings in order for them to show us how they have improved their compliance. We encourage subject persons to contact us if they wish to share with us their improvements or even if they require any guidance from our end. And now I will go through the process of supervisory meetings. Firstly, subject persons are selected from our end. We also decide about the focus. It can be BRA, policies and procedures, CRA, CDD, or even PEPs. After that, subject person is notified on the supervisory meeting via telephone call, and then a notification letter is sent to the subject person. In that letter, we request a number of documentation information which may differ, but usually include the following. It can be latest BRA, policies and procedures, list of clients for the past 2 years, and then we also request the customer files of their choice. After that, the officers start reviewing the documentation provided and the latest RAQ. Further documentation and clarifications, if needed, can be requested by the officer. After that, a supervisory meeting with the MLRO is held. Then the case is prepared for the supervision committee meeting, and following such, the letter with observations and informal communication is issued to the subject person. Now I would like to run through the process of a compliance examination, which allows the FIAU to have a holistic picture of the subject person and their operation. The process includes 3 stages: pre-examination stage, examination stage, and post-examination stage, which I will be explaining further in the next slides. The duration depends on various factors such as subject person's cooperation, the scope of examination, number of files to be reviewed, or even the complexity of the files provided. Mostly, upon conclusion of the file review, the subject person is contacted to hold a closure meeting. The timeframes may also differ where the examination is ad hoc. However, as already pointed out, such would be clearly explained to the subject person. So let us start with the pre-examination stage. I would like to briefly run through the procedural steps of an examination and the types of communications you can expect from us. Where the visit is announced, you will receive a telephone call from us informing you of the examination. During the call, we will discuss your availability, and we appreciate when the subject persons advise us of any absence they are already aware of. Such allows us to plan the examination ahead. Following the call, a notification letter will be issued. Usually, it takes place 3 weeks prior to the date of the examination. It will also state the tentative length of the examination. However, different timeframes may be applicable depending on the scope of the examination. In the same notification letter, a number of documents will be requested from your end, as further will be explained in the next slides. The compliance examination usually comprises of a team of 2 to 3 compliance officers, which includes a lead compliance officer, who will be responsible of the supervision of the subject person, as well as supporting officers. Again, timing may vary slightly given the scope of the examination, but the deadlines I mentioned are the most common ones. As mentioned, the notification letter will contain a request for information, which includes BRA, CRA template, and applicable methodology, policies and procedures, onboarding forms, and list of customers. With respect to list of customers, we can include a list of specific details that we might deem necessary to be included in that list. This list in the notification letter is non-exhaustive and only represents an overview of the documents we may request. The deadline for provision of such documentation is usually a week. You may refer to the record-keeping chapter of the IPs, which provides useful guidance on the records which are to be kept by the subject persons, especially for presentation to supervisory authorities. Now let us move on to the examination stage. The examination stage starts with an initial interview with the MLRO, which is held in order to get some information with regards to the business activities of the subject person, as well also as obtain better understanding of the policies and procedures implemented. However, we may also conduct interviews with other employees where relevant. For example, we can request a meeting with compliance officers or admin staff undertaking compliance functions like transaction monitoring, perhaps, or performance of CRA. Then after that, we move to control design testing. It includes an assessment of whether the subject person has sufficient and adequate controls, policies, and procedures in place to address AML CFT obligations. At this stage, we would review subject person's written policies and procedures. Next would be control implementation effectiveness testing, which refers to file review. A sample of customers is tested to assess whether the controls in place are being effectively implemented by the subject person. The number of files reviewed depends on the scope of the examination. Subject persons are requested to provide information and documentation as requested for each file selected to demonstrate their compliance. The documentation is analyzed to assess adherence to such obligations. After that, we hold a closure meeting with the subject person and follow with the reporting stage. At that stage, the results of compliance examination are presented by the lead officer to the FIAU Supervision Committee to decide on the type of actions to be taken. I will be explaining this process in further details on the following slides. As previously mentioned, there is usually a 3-week gap between the date of the notification letter and the first meeting with the MLRO. Even in situations where this gap is shorter, the process shown here is the typical process that we follow. Now, there might be an ad hoc examination which don't follow this exact process. For example, meetings may not be held where the review is focused on a limited number of files, or the subject person is clearly informed that they must upload all documentation requested and that the documentation will be taken as final. However, as I already mentioned, the subject person will be clearly notified of the process which will be followed. I would like to also highlight that it's important for the subject person to be available throughout the examination in order for the FIAU officers to ask questions during such course, which might be necessary to understand the files. With respect to the introductory meeting, also known as a kick-off meeting, such is held between the examining team and the MLRO. Of course, other subject persons, officials may be present for this meeting. However, the questions will be always directed to the MLRO. We also understand that other employees may have more practical explanations and they would perform certain tasks on a daily basis. The purpose of this meeting is for the lead officer to present the aim and scope of the examination and to inform the subject person about the next steps of this examination. The subject person may also raise questions in respect of the process to be carried out and the expected timeframes and availability required. The meeting also offers an opportunity for the FIAU officials to understand how the subject persons operate. Now we can move on to the control testing, which is split between the testing of the framework introduced by the subject person and testing of the customer files. With respect to the control testing, control design testing, assessment on whether the subject person has sufficient and adequate controls, policies, and procedures in place to address AML CFT obligations. It consists of a review of subject person's written policies and procedures. As an example, it can also consist a review of an automated systems used for ongoing monitoring, performance of CRAs, or even transaction monitoring. Then we move to the customer file review. A sample of customers is tested to assess whether the controls in place are being effectively implemented by the subject person. The number of files reviewed depends on the scope of the examination. We will ask for the file to be uploaded on our sharing platform. The documentation is then analyzed to assess the level of adherence to the obligation. During the file review, the FIAU officials may request further information or documentation, which was maybe not found on file, or perhaps something was unclear for us. Such request is usually done through a missing documentation sheet, which is given to the MLRO. So here I would like to point out that the subject person is given ample opportunity to provide any relevant information and documentation. Regarding timing, this varies depending on the scope of the examination. Usually, the files are requested after the kickoff meeting. However, we may also request files beforehand. This would allow us to see how the customer files are recorded and allow us to ask any questions during the meeting, if anything is unclear for us. Furthermore, recently, we had adopted the approach where we request specific documentation. This is normally done during the thematic or targeted reviews. So rather than requesting the entire file, we will send a list of documents required, which also includes a comment box where the subject person can provide their explanations. Of course, with the ad hoc visits, we sometimes give the subject person a stricter deadline and can make only one request. In these cases, it is imperative that the subject person provides any documentation they deem relevant. Once we conclude the review, we usually hold a closing meeting with the subject person. During the meeting, we provide subject persons with a summary of the visit and the way forward. The shortcomings are highlighted to the subject person so that they can start working on such shortcomings and take remedial action between the time of the meeting and the receipt of the compliance review report. The shortcomings mentioned are a summary of the main points noted, so they are not discussed in detail during the meeting. But after the meeting, the final outcome and detailed findings are to be expected in the letter that follows the examination. Also, it is important to highlight that the shortcomings presented are not exhaustive nor final, which means that the points mentioned during the meeting will not necessarily be included in the final communication, and vice versa. The final communication may include comments or shortcomings that were not mentioned during the meeting. And moreover, this meeting gives the subject person an opportunity to ask any questions on the way forward and expected timeframes. Now we can move on to the post-examination stage. At this stage, the outcome of the examination is being decided. For this purpose, the FIAU chose supervisory tools and measures that are proportionate to the materiality and significance of the shortcomings identified during the examination, and which take into consideration the level of risk to which the subject person is exposed to. So once a compliance examination is concluded, relevant factors are taken into consideration to determine the appropriate procedure to be followed. As you can see on this slide, there are three possible outcomes. With respect to the closure letter, such is issued where no findings or minor findings were identified during the examination. We have also remediation letter, which is issued to the subject person, requesting the subject person to take remedial action in the case where no serious findings were noted. In this case, the outcome is then tackled by the supervisory section and more specifically, supervision committee. This process will be further explained by my colleague Clyde shortly. And lastly, we have potential breaches letter, such as issued to the subject person when serious, systemic, and/or repetitive findings are noted. The outcome of which is then tackled by the enforcement section, which will be then explained by my colleague Jeremy. In the previous slide, I mentioned that a number of relevant factors are taken into consideration to determine the appropriate procedure to be followed after the conclusion of the compliance examination. Here we are going to see some of these factors. It can be overall regard to AML and CFT obligations shown by the subject person's cooperation shown through the compliance examination, type of findings identified, size and sector of the subject person, and the impact of the AML-CFT breach on the jurisdiction. It is important to note that this list is not exhaustive, and other factors can be considered at this stage. Now, since I know that the examination may be a bit stressful for the subject persons, I would like to share with you some pointers on how to make this examination faster and smoother. Firstly, think about planning. Make yourself available for any questions that we may ask. We don't expect you to stop your business operations, but to inform us beforehand if you will not be available. Also, dedicate time to plan and implement remedial actions once you become aware of any weaknesses. It's also important that record keeping should not start when an examination is announced, but should be part of doing your business. You should also be on time with your replies and submissions and provide complete data. We understand that the subject person may struggle with timeframes. However, if you are unable to meet any deadlines, please contact us accordingly and we will discuss it. It is important that you will also demonstrate your ability and willingness to implement remedial actions to fulfill your AML and CFT obligations. It is also crucial that you own your own procedures. Even if the procedures were not drafted internally, but with the help of consultants, it is important that you know and understand your procedures. Make them your own rather than rely on the template provided by the consultants. Also, it's very important, show cooperation. Make use of this examination as you may learn from the experience. Also, communicate to us any concerns or issues that you may have, or even your understanding of why and how certain actions were taken from your end. The more cooperation with the FIAU officers, the less time will be spent on the examination, and therefore you will encounter less business disruption. I would also like to point out that cooperation or lack of it may be communicated to CMC and may affect the subject person's risk rating. Also, be proactive and focus on what you can remediate or improve. And lastly, prove your compliance, as the onus will always be on you to show that you comply with your AML CFT obligations. Now, we can move on and look into one of the possible outcomes, the remedial actions, which will be presented by my colleague Clyde.
So thank you, Barbara. I'm Clyde and I form part of the remediation team within the supervision section of the FIAU. My part of the presentation will focus on the procedures followed after the conclusion of a compliance examination, but in cases where the FIAU determines that a remediation process should be followed. I will also explain what is expected from subject persons during a remediation process and which factors are taken into consideration by the FIAU when assessing whether remedial actions are adequately implemented by the subject person. During my presentation, I will focus on the left part of this diagram, the part where we request remedial action as a compliance examination outcome. As already explained by my colleagues, as was requested from subject persons via the implementing procedures, the FIAU has also moved towards a risk-based supervisory model in accordance with FATF standards and EU directives. For this purpose, the FIAU chooses supervisory tools and measures which take into consideration the level of risk to which the subject person is exposed. And it also takes into consideration measures that are proportionate to the materiality and significance of the specific shortcomings identified during the examination. So generally speaking, once again to recap, once a compliance examination is concluded, relevant factors are taken into consideration to determine the appropriate procedure to be followed. And unless a closure letter is issued where no shortcomings were identified during the examination, the process will either include the issuance of a remediation letter to the subject person or the issuance of a potential breaches letter to the subject person, which Barbara will explain in more detail later on. Before I take you through the procedures followed when the subject person is requested to take some form of remedial action, I would like to give you some more background on the FIAU's Supervision Committee. In short, I will refer to the Supervision Committee as the SC. As I mentioned before, taking into consideration various factors such as the materiality of the shortcomings identified and the risks to which the subject person is exposed, the FIAU determines if a compliance examination report should be issued to the subject person. In all other cases, the findings identified during the examination are presented to the SC. The SC is a committee which was established by the FIAU in the first quarter of 2021, and its purpose is to determine the outcome of compliance examinations of subject persons, to assess the adequacy of any remedial plans proposed by subject persons to address the shortcomings identified during the examination, and to assess the effective implementation of remedial actions taken by subject persons to address the shortcomings identified. So ultimately, and in short, the SC determines the actions to be taken in respect of the findings identified. Here, I think it's very important to highlight that the SC is made of a number of persons, minimum 3. So it's not just one person taking decisions here. Members have to either unanimously agree on a particular decision taken, or at least the majority of the members have to agree. That is, if there are 3 members, at least 2 of them have to agree. As we can see in the diagram, the members of an SC can vary from the head of supervision to a senior associate. Juniors and associates cannot be members of an SC meeting. The person leading the SC should be a person holding a position within the supervision section, which should not be below the grade of manager. So at least one of the members of the SC has to hold a grade of a manager or more. Furthermore, members from the legal section may also attend to assist members in arriving at a particular decision with respect to a specific shortcoming. It's also important to highlight that any conflicts of interest are also taken into account here when setting up an SC meeting, meaning that if any member of the SC has some form of conflict of interest with respect to the subject person in question, then they are replaced by someone else, a different member. Now, to be more specific, here we can see that following the assessment of the findings by the supervision committee, which were identified during the examination, there are 2 separate possible remediation outcomes, which are option A, the issuance of a closure letter, when no potential breaches of the PML, FTR, or the IPs have been identified. In the case of a closure letter, no observations or only minor observations are normally identified during the examination. Or option B, the issuance of a remediation letter to the subject person. This remediation letter requests subject persons to take specific remedial actions within a stipulated time frame in order to address the non-serious shortcomings identified during the compliance examination. As you can see here, the potential breaches letter is not one of the outcomes following an SC meeting. At this stage, I think it's also important to explain the meaning of shortcomings and observations, which are sometimes outlined in reports and letters sent to subject persons. Shortcomings are considered by the FIAU to be potential breaches of AML CFT obligations emanating from the PML, FTR, and IPs, and therefore there is an expectation that the subject person shall take some form of remedial action to address such shortcomings. It's important to highlight here that shortcomings outlined constitute potential breaches of AML CFT obligations, and the breaches are not yet conclusive at this stage. Observations then, on the other hand, are intended to draw the attention of the subject person towards areas which can be further improved to strengthen their AML CFT control framework. But when it comes to observations, there is no explicit expectation by the FIAU to implement remedial actions to address such observations. So now focusing on the closure letter, which is the first possible outcome explained in my previous slides, we already explained that a closure letter is issued when no or only minor observations in the AML CFT compliance program are identified during a compliance examination. The letter is also issued when the subject person demonstrates that sufficient remedial action had already been implemented to address any gaps identified by the compliance examination team. So the closure letter may also include some recommendations for the subject person to further strengthen its AML CFT control framework. So here it's important to note that a closure letter can in fact be issued immediately following a compliance examination when it falls under the first point of the slide, or else it can be issued following the issuance of a remediation letter, which would fall under the second point of this slide because remedial action was adequately implemented following a remediation letter. Now, the second possible outcome, the remediation letter, in this case, the subject person will receive this letter detailing the process of the examination and the findings identified during the examination. The findings are based on the system and file review and the clarifications provided by the subject person during the course of the examination. Specifically, when a remediation letter is issued, this letter highlights the shortcomings which were identified by the supervision committee as presented by the compliance examination team, and any observations made by the supervision committee itself. The letter also highlights a description of the sections in the PML FTR and IPs which the subject person potentially breached as a result of the shortcomings identified. Then, most importantly, the subject person, through the remediation letter, is requested to take remedial actions to address these specific shortcomings and to submit information and documentation to the supervision committee within a specific time frame. This will then assist the supervision committee to assess the effective implementation of the remedial actions. Now, following the issuance of the remediation letter, the subject person is given the opportunity to implement the remedial actions detailed in the letter by submitting the requested information and documentation to the supervision committee. Here I would like to highlight the importance of substantiating information with supporting documentation where applicable, and most importantly, of providing a response in the same order followed in the remediation letter, as this allows for a clearer presentation to the supervision committee and also helps avoid delays in the subject person receiving a response. It's also important as well to submit documentation, any attached documentation, in the same order followed in the remediation letter as well. In this case, where additional documents are to be submitted, for instance, the subject person has proactively taken additional remedial actions and have updated their procedures, so they believe these are relevant to their response. The subject person should attach a copy of the said procedures to their response and clearly refer to the relevant annex or appendix in their letter. The remediation process, as explained above, is providing the opportunity to subject persons so they implement remedial actions as guided specifically by the authority in the remediation letter. So needless to say, the subject person should provide their response within the timeframe stipulated in the remediation letter. Now, when we receive that response, the supervision committee then meets again to discuss the remediation letter, as well as the information and documentation submitted by the subject person, so as to determine whether the remedial actions are effectively implemented and to agree if a closure letter should be issued to the subject person or if the case should be referred to the Compliance Monitoring Committee, in short, the CMC, which is a separate procedure that will be covered in more detail by the enforcement section. So we should know that when a remediation letter is issued to the subject person following a compliance examination, in cases where the subject person does not intend to take any form of remedial action requested through the remediation letter, they may submit their representations to CMC, explaining why the shortcomings outlined in the remediation letter are not to be considered as breaches of the respective provisions of the PML, FTR, and IPs. When this option exists, it will be included in the conclusion section of the remediation letter. So to recap one last time, here we can see a quite simple diagram explaining the different outcomes of the remediation process. First, findings are always presented to the SC, to the supervision committee, which then concludes on the shortcomings identified during the examination. In option A, a closure letter is issued right away, and the case is closed. In option B, a remediation letter will be issued, which requests the subject person to take remedial action in order to address the shortcomings identified, and also to submit information and documentation evidencing this effective implementation of the remedial action. Following the issuance of a remediation letter, a closure letter may be issued here unless the subject person did not implement the remedial actions or did not effectively implement them, in which case the matter may be escalated to CMC for their consideration and deliberation. The Supervision Committee may also agree to issue an observations and shortcomings report following a Supervision Committee meeting, but only in exceptional cases, requesting the subject person to propose a plan in this case to address the shortcomings identified. This is not usually applicable. Instead, the Supervision Committee normally decides that a remediation letter is issued right away, in which case the Supervision Committee determines the remedial actions to be implemented specifically rather than first asking the subject person to come up with a plan. Now I will explain what the review and assessment procedure usually involves during a remediation process. The information and documentation provided by the subject person during the remediation process is reviewed in detail at this stage. And this process usually entails a review of the proposed remedial actions or action plan in an effort to assess whether these are adequate to address the shortcomings identified. At this stage, the Supervision Committee also determines if the timeframes suggested for completion of the action plan, as proposed by the subject person, are in fact realistic and reasonable. During this process, the committee also carries out an assessment of the ability of the subject person to take appropriate actions to mitigate the risks which emanate from the shortcomings identified. In the case when a subject person is required to respond to a remediation letter and thus has to provide specific remedial action, this process will consist of a review of the information and documentation provided by the subject person to determine whether the requested remedial actions are effectively implemented within the specified timeframe. Important to note here that the subject person's understanding of the AML CFT obligations is also assessed through the information and documentation which is provided by the subject person itself. During this process, during the review and assessment process, a meeting may also be set up with key personnel of the subject person so as to better understand the remedial actions taken or planned in order to clarify any relevant matters which might help the SC meeting members in making a decision based on the information available. A system walkthrough may also be arranged at this stage, especially in cases where the subject person specifies that a new system has been implemented in order to address some of the shortcomings identified during the examination, as this will help us to test how the remedial actions are implemented in practice and determine whether the internal controls are adequate to remediate the shortcomings identified. Now, some factors which are taken into consideration when assessing the subject person's remediation plan or remedial actions include the ability and willingness of the subject person to remediate the shortcomings, which would be quite clear in the way the subject person responds to a report or remediation letter. The potential impact that these shortcomings may have on the subject person's wider internal controls framework. The probability of a repeat or a systemic weakness is also taken into consideration here on a macro level. The overall regard to AML CFT obligations shown by the subject person through their response, and also any self-imposed remediation plan put in place by the subject person, showing that the subject person is ultimately in a position to identify its weaknesses and take action to address such weaknesses. Subject persons should be proactive. Ideally, they should not limit themselves in taking action to address only the shortcomings identified during the examination. Now, to conclude, I would like to share some points which will help in making the remediation process faster and smoother. During the examination, the subject person is already informed of weaknesses identified in the AML CFT framework. So in such a case, it would be ideal to immediately put in place a plan to address such weaknesses. Following the examination, the subject person is made aware through a remediation letter of the shortcomings identified. When the subject person is asked to implement remedial actions within a specified time frame, the subject person should plan appropriately and allocate the necessary resources, and if needed, seek for external advice in order to ensure that remedial actions are effectively implemented in a timely manner. It's important to always communicate with the FIAU if you are unable to meet deadlines due to unforeseen circumstances. It's also very important to make yourself available during the remediation process, as we've seen in the previous slides, because there may be requests for clarifications via email or also requests for remote meetings. Even requests for system walkthroughs, as mentioned earlier, can be made. Cooperation is very important. It is vital to demonstrate your ability and willingness to implement remedial actions and fulfill your AML CFT obligations. Because this, again, cooperation will be assessed during a supervision committee, as we've seen in the previous slides. The element of proactivity is also very important here. It's always positively acknowledged by the supervision committee that subject persons do not limit themselves to implement the specific remedial actions requested. It's important that you also focus on what you can do to remediate any weaknesses identified to further strengthen your AML CFT framework. Another point I would like to stress here is that of self-imposed remediation plans. The FIAU expects all subject persons to have processes in place to identify any weaknesses in the AML CFT regulatory framework, either through internal audit or internal review, or through seeking advice by third-party experts as well. It's always positively acknowledged by the FIAU that the subject person understands the MLFT risk and are able to identify and remediate weaknesses in their processes and systems prior to being requested to do so by the FIAU. So I think here, following this part of the presentation, it came out quite clearly that enforcement actions must be proportionate, and that is why in certain situations pecuniary fines are applicable, and in other cases measures taken are less punitive. In fact, fines are usually applied in case when very serious or serious breaches of AML CFT obligations are detected, whereas in less serious cases, the FIAU would only impose a request for subject persons to address gaps noted through the implementation of remedial action. We, as a remediation team, are here to help subject persons address these gaps in an effective way. So our objective as a remediation team is to ultimately help you strengthen your AML CFT regulatory framework and help each other fight the risk of money laundering and terrorist financing through our jurisdiction. The priority of the FIAU is ultimately to ensure that any weakness in subject person systems and processes are identified as early as possible and are remediated as fast as possible. So remember that ultimately both the FIAU and the subject persons are on the same side of the fence when it comes to the fight against money laundering and terrorist financing. So let's all work together to ensure that subject persons have a strong AML CFT framework and prevent criminals from using their services for MLFT purposes. So now we will move on to the potential breaches letter, which will be explained in further detail by Barbara.
Thank you, Clyde. I will be briefly explaining the process of the potential breaches letter. So you might be wondering what distinguishes these two processes. As already explained by Clyde, it is the seriousness of the findings. So following the process of internal categorization, once the potential breaches letter is chosen, after the draft is issued, such is handled by FIAU enforcement section. I would like to highlight that it does not necessarily mean that every subject person in receipt of a potential breaches letter will incur an administrative penalty in the form of a fine, as the enforcement section also has the power to issue remediations and even closure letters. With respect to the process, the subject person will receive a potential breaches letter detailing the process of the examination itself, as well as the regulatory obligations and the FIAU findings. I would like to point out here that the letter lays out potential breaches of the regulations, and these breaches are not conclusive. The subject person is given the opportunity to provide representations. We strongly encourage this to be done, as not submitting representation is not seen positively and does not allow the FIAU to understand the steps that subject person has taken to remediate the findings. The subject person might also opt to, as an additional to the written representations, to provide oral representations. However, such are not binding and are rather an opportunity for the subject person to provide further clarifications to the written representations. Any additional representations provided during the oral submissions, other than the ones already listed in a written format, would need to be formally submitted in writing after the meeting. The subject person normally has 30 days to submit representations. Sometimes this time frame can be shorter depending on the report. However, the date applicable for the subject person is always included in the letter. In the representations, it is important that the subject person mention any new processes adopted since the compliance examination to show that they are being proactive and already remediating any breaches they agree with. So even any documentation supporting this should be provided. Then the Compliance Monitoring Committee meets to discuss the report as well as the subject person's representation in order to determine whether the potential breach constitutes a breach or not, and thereafter to determine the action to be taken where they determine that it does constitute a breach. Further details on the process, outcome, and actions taken by the CMC will be now presented by my colleague, Jeremy.
Thank you, Clyde and Barbara, for that introduction. So as they explained, now I'm going to move on to the enforcement process. So the FIAU's enforcement process as to what happens after a potential breach letter is issued. So to start with, I'm going to introduce the legislative background on which the FIAU's enforcement section can operate. Basically, the FIAU is empowered to enforce the provisions found under the Prevention of Money Laundering Act and the Prevention of Money Laundering and Funding of Terrorism regulations, as well as any guidance issued in the implementing procedures. These are extracted from Chapter 373 of the Laws of Malta and 373.01 of the Laws of Malta. Also, the FIAU is empowered to impose any administrative measure on identified breaches of AML and CFT obligations. This in terms of the FIAU's powers under Article 13 of the PMLA and Regulation 21 of the PML-FTR. Moving on to the types of administrative measures that the FIAU may impose, basically there are different types of administrative measures which may be imposed, and the FIAU may choose to impose any one separately or a combination thereof of such administrative measures. To start with, the FIAU is empowered to impose administrative penalties whenever there are identified repeated serious or systematic breaches, or a combination thereof. Administrative penalties vary depending on the activity being offered by the subject person, and for the subject persons offering relevant activity, a maximum of 1 million euros may be imposed, or else not exceeding twice the amount of the benefit derived from the contravention. On the other hand, subject person providing relevant financial business, a maximum administrative penalty of 5 million may be imposed, or else not exceeding 10% of the total annual turnover. Another type of administrative measure that may be imposed is the imposition of directives. The FIAU's enforcement section may impose either remediation or follow-up directives. The difference between the two is that one is more intrusive than the other one, The latter being the follow-up directive, wherein we request the subject person to meet regularly with us to explain the remediation that is being undertaken, and they would be required to adhere to such remediation within specific time frames too. Another type of administrative measure is written reprimands. These are used whenever the breach did not give rise to significant consequence. Nonetheless, it's not acceptable and should not be repeated. And this will then be taken into consideration when assessing any future cases of non-compliance. So it's like a warning. Also, another type of administrative measure is the publication. So the FIAU publishes all the administrative measures imposed. However, the types of publications vary. For example, whenever an administrative penalty exceeding 50K is imposed, that particular subject person is published by name. However, any other penalties below the 50K threshold are published on an anonymous basis. Other administrative measures are available to the FIAU, such as offering a recommendation to the prudential regulator, even the possibility of taking joint action with the prudential regulator. The FIAU may also impose a directive to terminate a particular business relationship, and even a directive to appoint an independent auditor. Moving on to the enforcement process, as my colleagues explained, the report with a potential breach is issued by the FIAU supervision section, after which the subject person is provided with a specified time frame to provide any representations. Here it's important to emphasize, as Barbara mentioned, that in the representation, subject persons should provide any other explanations or evidence that they might have to prove compliance, and any type of explanation that they might show that they're not actually in potential breach of the particular obligation. Also, it is imperative for subject persons to include any potential remediation taken or planned to be taken to remediate their position on any highlighted potential breach. After receipt of the representations, the case is assigned to an enforcement official within the FIAU section, in which a review process is carried out and analysis of the potential breach issued along with the representations is undertaken, and then the case is presented in its totality to the Compliance Monitoring Committee of the FIAU. I shall be providing further explanations on the composition of the CMC and what it is empowered to do in the upcoming slides. So after the case is presented to the CMC decides whether the potential breach is confirmed as a breach or otherwise. If the breach is confirmed, then the CMC would then determine what type of administrative measure is warranted. As explained earlier, there are different types of administrative measures, and the CMC may decide to impose either one or a combination of more administrative measures. After this, the letter is drafted, reviewed, and then communicated to the subject person. And the letter will include all the details that the CMC has deliberated on, and even on the final outcome of the case. So may it be a position of administrative penalty, a remediation directive, or any other administrative measure is explained. After this, then, as an enforcement section, we work with the subject person to remediate its position, and the subject person may, in other instances, also deem that they wish to file an appeal in front of the local courts. So that's the process with regards to enforcement. As I explained, I shall be delving into deeper into the Compliance Monitoring Committee. So what is the Compliance Monitoring Committee? The Compliance Monitoring Committee is an internal organ set up by the FIAU to, one, evaluate findings in relation to potential breaches of AML CFT obligations, and also, whenever a breach is identified, to impose the most appropriate measure to address the determined breach. Also, who does the CMC is composed with? Who are the members within this famous Compliance Monitoring Committee? As illustrated on this slide, the CMC is composed of any of these members, including the FIAU's director, the FIAU deputy director, head of enforcement, senior official enforcement, senior official legal affairs, and the secretary. It is imperative to note that the secretary is not a member of the CMC and does not have voting rights. And the Compliance Monitoring Committee is chaired by the FIAU's director, or in his absence, by the FIAU's deputy director. Moving on, what tools does the CMC have at its disposal? So what does it apply in determining its decisions and in its deliberations? Basically, there are two main tools that the CMC has at its disposal, first being the sanctions policy, and second being the sanctions tool. What is the sanctions policy? Basically, the sanctions policy aims to ensure that the CMC's decisions are proportionate, effective, and dissuasive, and they guide the CMC in their decisions to ensuring same. Also, this sanctions policy outlines the administrative measures that the CMC is empowered to take, as explained in my earlier slides, and also provides guidance on what considerations to take to decide the administrative measure to impose. Finally, the sanctions policy provides guidance on the interpretation of serious, systematic, and repetitive, and how these can be used to determine whether a breach falls under any of such categories. Moving on to the sanctions tool. The sanctions tool is a tool which is adopted by the CMC to determine the appropriate administrative measure to impose. Within this tool, there are several considerations which are taken into account by the CMC, some of which are categorized under aggravating factors and other under mitigating factors. So this means that there are some considerations which makes the particular breach more serious and others which might reduce the seriousness of specific breaches. To provide further explanations in relation to the sanctions tool and the aggravating and mitigating factors, to start with seriousness. With regards to seriousness, one has to consider the nature and materiality of a particular breach. I will be providing further examples on how this is done by the CMC and the different considerations taken to determine how material and the nature of a particular breach. Also, with regards to the seriousness, we take into consideration the time period within which the breach subsisted. So for how long has the subject person been operating under this specific breach? Another consideration is the systemic nature of a particular breach, and this basically it's an indication whether there are structural issues within the operations of the subject persons. And there are two types of systematic considerations, one being the qualitative and the second being the quantitative. So basically, the qualitative would be whether the particular procedure has a systematic impact on the subject person's operations. For example, failing to have a business risk assessment in place or a customer risk assessment methodology. While on the other hand, quantitative systematic can relate to whenever a particular breach is noticed in several number of files. So let's say in 90% of the files reviews, the particular subject person was found to not have carried out a CRA. Moving on to another factor being the repeated. So this refers to whether the subject person was found previously in another examination in breach of the same obligation. So here again, this would aggravate matters. Another consideration is the size and sector risk. So CMC in its deliberation takes into consideration whether the subject person is a corporate or an individual. It also distinguishes whether it is a micro or a large entity, and this is based on several considerations, some of which being the turnover and even the number of customers that the subject person services, and also the sector within which it operates, whether it's within the financial or non-financial sector. Another factor is the breach repercussions. So what impact did the subject person leave on the jurisdiction due to the breach that was found? Also, what is the level of facilitation of MLFT that resulted, if it can be calculated from the specific breach? Moving on to some other considerations. Another one being the level of cooperation. So how cooperative was the subject person throughout the examination process and even throughout the provision of his representations. Even with regards to the approach of AML, of his AML and CFT obligations, whether the subject person showed a good regard or totally disregarded his obligations. Even another factor would be the remedial action undertaken. So this would refer to whether the subject person has, one, either already remediated his position, or else he has already a plan in place to remediate its position. And this would again impact the outcome of the administrative measure chosen by the CMC. Finally, another consideration is whether any other administrative measures are being imposed by other authorities. For example, whether another authority has already initiated the process to cancel or terminate the subject person's license. It is imperative to note that the above considerations are not exhaustive and other considerations may be taken into account. So as I explained earlier, I shall be providing some examples in relation to how we determine the seriousness and materiality of a particular obligation. So for example, it's more serious for the subject person to not even try and determine who the beneficial owner is of his customer, as opposed it is less serious than that the subject person failed to verify the identity or the residential address through expired or outdated documentations. So these are the different level of seriousness tied to specific obligations. Another example is in relation to obligation to have a business risk assessment. It's more serious that the subject person failed to carry out a BRA. And that's again, in view of the other consideration that we mentioned, this also ties in with the regard and even when compared to that he failed to review the BRA annually. So this is discrepancy in the types of seriousness and materiality of a particular obligation. Another example is it's more serious that the CRA was not carried out rather than the CRA being carried out late. And finally, it is more serious that there was no training attended by employees or officials of the subject person, as opposed them having inadequate records kept to monitor which employees have received training and how frequent and the nature of the training provided. So I hope that this provides some further explanation as to how the FIAU determines the level of seriousness of specific AML CFT obligations. So now I shall provide a case comparison with some examples as to how the CMC and ultimately the FIAU determines the types of administrative measures to impose and how it ensures that the administrative measures imposed are effective, proportionate, and dissuasive. So in the first column, you can see a particular case which was imposed with an administrative penalty ranging between 80 and 100K. And in this case, that particular subject person failed to report suspicion of BO concealment in more than 3 files. It was also noticed that significant activity was undertaken, running in millions, and it signifies that there was further probability of facilitation of MLFT through this particular subject person servicing this particular customers. Also, it was noted that the failure persisted more than 1 year, so there is an element of duration, and it had quite a significant impact on the local jurisdiction in view of the activity that was undertaken. So tying this to the previous consideration, we have significant consideration, we have the seriousness of the obligation, and we have the element of duration and the impact on the local jurisdiction as aggravating factors. Then, as mitigating factors, this particular subject person was considered as a small subject person in view of its turnover, customer service, and other consideration. The subject person also showed a good level of cooperation with the FIAU. It was not a repetitive breach and it was not a systematic breach. So all these considerations led to the imposition of administrative penalty between 80 and 100K. Now, the next two columns, I'll compare them with each other to show that the different factors, how they work in practice, and it's a combination of all the considerations which then lead to the final imposition of the administrative measures. So case 2 and case 3 both relates to failure to report suspicion of BO concealment, and both relates to less than 2 files. So there was suspicion of BO concealment in less than 2 files. So one of the difference between the two, one was that there was significant activity undertaken, so I'm referring to case 3, while the second case, there was low level and minimal activity undertaken. So that's one difference between case 2 and case 3. However, it's imperative to note that the size of the subject person in case 2 was considered as large based on the turnover, number of customers, and other considerations, while in the case of case 3, the size of the subject person was considered as small. Finally, the failure persisted more than 1 year for case 2 and even for case 3. So taking these two consideration, given that case 2 was a large subject person, however, was producing minimal activity undertaking from these files which file in breached, the final administrative measure between 30K and 50K is similar to that imposed for a subject person who is smaller in size, however, was processing significant activity for such files which were found in breach. Hopefully, this gives you an understanding of the different considerations and how, when you combine all the factors taken into account, how the CMC determines the administrative measures to impose. Finally, I'd like to make reference to the publications. So basically, as I explained, all enforcement action issued by the FIAU are published on our website. On the slides, there is a link to the website where the publications are uploaded. And it's very important that subject persons refer to such publications and learn from the shortcomings of other subject persons to try and ensure that these are not repeated and not done by themselves. So basically, there's quite significant detail in the content uploaded. So first, there are the general details of the measure imposed, what supervisory action was taken, and the legal provisions breached. Then there is an explanations on the reasons leading to the decision, the measure imposed. So as I explained, the type of administrative measures imposed. And recently, since April 2022, we included a section of key takeaways. So what are the most important takeaways from this specific case that has been published on the websites? And also publications are updated with any subject persons which appeal and any updates on the appeal, including its outcome. So that's a wrap with regards to the enforcement process. Finally, I'd like to thank all the colleagues within the FIAU who contributed to these presentations. Also, I'd like to thank our colleagues who took their time to present today during this session, Barbara, Clyde, and Michael. Finally, should you have any questions about any of the content delivered today during these presentations, feel free to contact us on queries@fiaumalta.org. Thank you.